Testing 1, 2. Okay.
Oh, testing. Okay, folks, let's come back to our seats. Okay, let's grab our seat.
I think she went to the room.
She was going to check and see if they had a room for her.
We needed your sound pad to get the group back together. That's your job, remember? Just kidding. We needed your little ding, ding, ding. Make it not. Okay. So how was everybody get a decent break? All right, you look still pretty bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, so that's good. Now shift into substance, really starting to dig into the policy issue and then the proposition that you are going to be studying over the next few days. So you're going to hear first for the next 20 minutes will be with what we're calling a background expert who will talk to you about some of the policy issues surrounding the measure that you'll be studying. So he's not here to talk to you about Proposition 10, but he is here to talk to you about some background information that will help get you prepared to study the measure. Okay, so I'm going to introduce you to Liam Dillon, and he will introduce himself a little bit further. Liam will have about 15 minutes, up to about 15 minutes to talk to you, and then we'll go through another 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A with him. And I'll just remind folks to take turns. If you have a burning question, make sure the burning question gets up there first, and then give others a chance to ask questions because we really have limited time with him and all of the. Liam, come on up.
Good? We're good? Better? Okay. Hi. So I'm Liam Dillon. I'm a reporter with the Los Angeles Times. I work is now in California and why it's such an issue at the moment. So we're starting with just the fact that California has a very problem. So home ownership rates in California are at their lowest since World War II. More than 1.7 million California families spend more than half their income on rent, which is a huge number. And in fact, the majority of renters spend more than 30% of their income on rent, which is the federal definition of being rent burden. Rent burden if you spend more than 30% of your income on rent. And in California, more than half of all renters fit that status. It's even worse for a lot of families. So 6 of the nation's 10 most expensive rental markets are in California. And rents have increased 40% in the Bay Area over the last 3 years, which is obviously a huge number. And then just for some further context, median rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in LA is about $1,800 and $3,300 in San Francisco. So that's sinking in, that's good. Okay, so what California's rent controls are now. So right now in California, there are 15 cities across the state, including San Francisco and LA, that have some form of rent control. and 20% of the state's population lives in a city where there is rent control, but that does not mean 20% of the population is covered by rent control. That just means that this is sort of the areas in which they are. So San Francisco, LA, being the two most prominent examples in the state of locations where rent control exists. There's been a recent increase, as you expect, given numbers that I showed in the last slide, in cities that have passed some form in the Bay Area in 2016, Richmond, and also Mountain View, which is in Silicon Valley. And there have been signature gathering campaigns to add rent control in a number of cities across the state. To my knowledge, there are 2 that are going to be on the ballot. And these are local measures only in National City, which is south of San Diego, and in Denver. And then in California, however, the ability of cities and counties to expand the rent control is severely restricted. And that's because of a law called the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act. This law was passed in 1995, and it really does 3 major, really important things. The first is it says no rent control on single-family homes. So any city that currently has a rent control policy, wants to do one in the future, under this law, cannot put any rent control on single-family homes, only apartments, right? That's number 1. Number 2, local governments cannot mandate any price controls when tenants leave. So rent control apartments can be set aside for market rates when new tenants arrive. This is a little bit hard to understand, so let me give you an example of it. So say I'm living in a rent control apartment in LA. My rent is $1,000, and I'm allowed under the rules for it to increase by, say, 3% a year. So I'm living there the past 3 years. I decide to move to Sacramento, take a great new job with the LA Times. And my landlord then is allowed to charge whatever he or she wants for the next tenant to come in. Okay, that's a rule under Costa-Hawkins. A landlord has a right to be able to do that. And prior to Costa-Hawkins, there were some cities where those rent increases would sort of stay with the unit, right? Implementing rent control on properties built after 1995, when Costa-Hawkins passed, or when their existing rent control ordinance passed. So in LA, rent control passed in '78. That means LA not allowed to implement rent control on buildings that were built after 1970, only '78 and before. San Francisco, I believe, is '79. It really depends on what the year the city is passed the rent control ordinance. Of the newer cities, Mountain View and Richmond, they go back to '95. That's the latest they're allowed under the Costa-Hawkins rule. Does that all make sense too? Great. Okay, so what's going to be on the ballot in November is Proposition 10. And Proposition 10 is relatively simple in that the predominant thing it does is simply repeal the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act, the state law that was passed in 1995. And that does not mean that rent control automatically happens up and down the state. What that means is now cities and counties have the ability to add new rent control rules to do whatever they want that they're not allowed to do now. So it probably has seen, again, control everywhere. That means LA, for instance, say, our year, we want to put rent control on properties from 1995 now instead of '79 like we were only allowed to do under the law. Or a new city, say San Diego, which does not have rent control, could say, we'd like to do rent control, but only for properties that were built after 1985, right? That's something they could do if Costa-Hawkins were to go away and Prop 10 passes. So that's my general overview. Happy to take any questions about housing affordability issues in the state or what rent control in general would do in the regime in California.
Thank you. So I'm going to have us practice. Put your card up if you want to ask a question, and then we'll get you in the queue. And I'm going to actually need someone to do the queue. Oh, people are shuffling, like, make sure my card's not up. Now I want it up. Okay. So I have Michael S. Who else? I saw a bunch of shuffling over here. Okay, Michael. Use the mic, please.
When you say like rent controls put on the unit And when you leave and move out, and like I own houses and stuff and rent out personal house thing.
Yeah.
And let's say I upgraded the attic and I added 500 square feet to the attic.
Right.
Now I just added that 500 square feet, but I can't raise the rent. So why would I even want to do that?
Right.
I mean, that's just, I was working also.
I'll give you two points to that. The issue you bring up, that what is the incentive for landlords to improve their property if they're under a rent control regime? That is a common objection to any rent control in any way, shape, or form, right? Now, the supporters of rent control will count, well, all of these cities who have rent control have rent boards, and these rent boards, you as a landlord are allowed to petition the rent board to say, look, I put in X number of dollars to improve my unit. I should there be able to recoup that cost, and therefore, please allow me to do it. So there's a mechanism under which this sort of you are talking about could get calculated into a tenant's rent.
And who would be paying these bureaucrats that are forcing things go back to the speed rail train, the bullet train thing.
Yeah.
Nobody expected the money to be skyrocketing up, and then there is no train, and it's all basically money paying the bureaucrats and stuff. It's not going anywhere.
So the narrow answer to your question is that cities and counties, when they create rent boards, and they're all allowed to be different, right, are allowed to talk about how the rent boards would be paid for. Most commonly, it's paid for with a fee on the landlords. That's the most common way that they pay for the the administration of the rent boards.
Okay. Tim, and then Shirley. Tim's getting his first practice using the microphone, so if you could hand him.
So you mentioned that Prop 10 is basically the repealing of the Costa-Hawkins Act.
Correct.
So there is no mandate to any of the local governments to do anything, including create those boards, or?
Correct.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
Under the rent control or price control of the properties, is there any impact on the personal property taxes of the owner? If my property is under rent control, are my personal property taxes impacted in any kind of way?
So these are two separate rules. Under California, many of you hopefully are familiar with Proposition 13 and how Proposition 13 limits property tax increases. And so there's no changes to Proposition 13 or any property tax rules under any rent control regime, including if Prop 10 were to pass.
Michael C.
Is there any delineation between commercial owners and private owners?
With respect to rent control?
Yeah.
No. So there's no, well, let me back up. Cities can, if Prop 10 were to pass, cities can make their own rules for how rent control would work. So in theory, I suppose a city could make up a rule that would delineate between small landlords and perhaps institutional landlords. I think there are other jurisdictions around the country that try to do something like that. So to my knowledge, there's nowhere in California that currently has a system like that, but presumably it would be legal in other ways. You could devise a system where that would work, where that I think, or that would be possible, I suppose. Where I feel like, or I've heard do that around the country would be single family homes. Look, we don't care if an individual homeowner were to rent out their property, but if we have someone who owns 5, 10, a dozen single family homes in the community, we may want to ensure there's rent control on those owners. That's obviously a much more onerous system to sort of keep track of, but that is theoretically possible if Prop 10 were to pass.
All right. One last.
You keep mentioning cities. Does it apply to the county as well?
Yes, any local government. Yes, cities and counties.
Let me just do one more scan if anybody hasn't asked a question. This will be our last one, I believe. Okay, go ahead, Michael.
All right. The only thing I'm just concerned about is like this gives a politician to say, hey, I'll make your life a lot better if in my municipality, if you vote for me in, and I'll change the rules for rent control. I mean, this whole proposition kind of sounds like the politicians want it so they can kind of tell the people that if they just vote for them and they'll implement rent control and make things better. But do you believe it's going to be cheaper for the people, or can I ask you on your belief?
Yeah, right. Short answer is I'm, as a reporter who writes about this issue, I don't sort of value positions. I think it's, as I think you'll hear over the coming days, there's a lot of literature that suggests sort of both sides of the equation.
Very diplomatic.
Trying-
That was threading that needle
Trying to
well.
get that
Okay.
straight in there.
So let's just round of applause for your first background expert. Thank you for being here with us. And we're going to pivot now to actually looking at the measures. So thanks for your time today. Hopefully you took some notes there. We're going to give you an opportunity now to actually read the text of the measure. And there will be, who's reading the measure out loud? Okay, so Damon will actually be, where will you be, Damon? In the back corner. If you'd rather hear the text of the measure read aloud, you can go back and Damon will be reading it aloud. So if that's a way for you to absorb it and process it, do it that way. Otherwise, you can turn to, you'll be looking at pages 34 through 45 in your binders. This is the full text of the measure. It will include the ballot title and summary, the measure text, the explanatory statement, and the fiscal impact statement. And we're going to give you about 25 minutes to just read through this. Just try to absorb what this measure, what the proposition is saying. And remember that still your job is to stay in learning mode. So you're really trying to take this information in and trying to understand it, which invites you to suspend judgment at this point about how you're evaluating this measure. Your job really is not to evaluate this measure just yet. It's to try to understand it. So get the information in, and then we'll go through the course of the days to start to take a deeper dive in evaluating it, okay? So we'll give you a 5-minute warning. And like I said, if you want to go off anywhere you want to go to read it on your own, or find Damon in the back corner, and he will be reading it aloud. 34 through 45. All right, so we have about 5 more minutes break. So if you need a little extra time after the 5 minutes, you can take a little extra time. But we will be starting promptly at 3:25 with opening statements from the advocate teams. So I'll cue you at 3:15 to take a 10-minute break. But if you do need a couple extra minutes to read the text, you can do that. Break time. Break time or just chill. But everybody, if I can ask you to please be back in your seats and ready to go at 3:25. That's when we're starting with the advocate opening statements. So do take a break if you can after you're done reading the text.
Can we start coming back, please?
I didn't watch any right now. It's been going all day. It started with late.
Are we ready? I'm ready.
Yes.
Thank you. Rose is ready. So we're about to get started with our pro and con presentations for today. It's our opportunity to hear from both sides. And so those who want the measure to pass, pro, those who want the measure to fail, con. There is no opportunity today to ask questions. So today we're just going to listen. Tomorrow we have lots of time to develop our questions, and then we'll ask the advocates tomorrow afternoon. The campaigns have provided you with a summary of their positions with up to 7 distinct claims for you to work with during the CIR process. So the claims, much like the ones we did in the practice piece, they are on page 54 in your binder. So in a moment, we're going to invite pro side up. Let me just tell you how it is all going to work. So our pro presenter will come up. They will speak for 20 minutes. We'll make an opening statement. And to be as fair as possible, we are going to time this. You will hear a loud beep. Can you simulate it? You will hear a loud beep when time is up. You will recognize it, I'm sure. We ask that you not applaud for either side. We can thank them at the end when all of them have finished their presentations. Is that everything? That's everything I have to say? Wow, that went fast. So at this point, I would like to invite up and introduce Christina Livingston. She is the executive director of the community organization ACE. And she will come up, as I said, 20 minutes to speak. You'll hear the ding, and then we'll go to hear the con side.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christina Livingston. I have a little cold, bear with me. I'm a listed proponent of Proposition 10, as well as the executive director of the statewide community group ACE, which is a co-sponsor of the Yes on Tin campaign committee. And on a personal note, until 4 months ago, I and my husband and my 2 young daughters were tenants renting in the Bay Area, and we were forced to move 2 times over the last 3 years because of the ever-increasing costs of rent. And we find ourselves here fortunate as homeowners, new homeowners in Sacramento. That isn't the story for everyone who's facing these increases. At ACE, we work with low-income and working-class communities, and particularly communities of color across 6 counties in the state. And our housing work within these communities is based on a vision of California where everyone has a safe, healthy, and affordable place to call home. But for many Californians, the rent is extremely unaffordable. We work with over 14,000 member families, and the vast majority of them are housing insecure, which is not uncommon in a state that, according to the US Census Bureau, has the highest poverty rate in the nation when you account for the cost of housing. A report from the California Budget and Policy Center points out that every county in the state of California, in every county, housing costs are unaffordable for the majority of residents. And according to the United Way, between the year 2000 and 2016, rents in California have gone up 85%. So while median household incomes are only increasing by 43%, rent is doubling what people are able to make. This is not sustainable. Another stark reality that the California Budget and Policy Center raises is more than half of California renters, half, are paying more than 30% on their income, making them rent burdened. And of that number of people, 8 in 10 low-income folks fall into that category. And for particularly vulnerable populations like seniors, those on fixed income, those that have no income, or low-income folks, college students, young professionals, for those folks, many are paying up to 70% of their income on rent, leaving very little behind to pay for other necessities like food or childcare or an emergency, like if your car breaks down. And as a result of the skyrocketing costs of rent, we have seen massive displacement, particularly, but not exclusively, of Black and brown folks and low-income residents from all of California's urban centers. People are being pushed to far-flung communities, forced away from their communal and familial ties, forced into hour-long commutes that have negative impacts on air quality, on road conditions, on mental health. And they and their families are left to deal with the trauma of a sudden move simply because there are no protections available to them. The Census Bureau data points to the 138,000 families who were driven out of the state in 1 year's time. I'll just note that housing insecurity, the constant threat of eviction or moving involuntarily, creates enormous stress on renters, including depression, heart problems, and other health issues. Even worse, far too many of these folks are being forced into homelessness. According to the Sacramento Bee, California is home to nearly 25% of the nation's homeless population due to the state's high cost of living. Large encampments have sprung up across the state, and the homeless include children, the elderly, disabled folks, veterans. There is a direct link between increased housing costs and homelessness, making it even more urgent to take the shackles off of local governments so that they can act to curb excessive rent increases. Since lower income people and people of color are far more likely to be tenants than homeowners, gentrification is accelerating across California due to the dramatic rent hikes. Living paycheck to paycheck means it's difficult for working people like service professionals and grocery clerks to afford affordable housing in the communities they serve and still have enough money for basics like groceries, gas, and childcare. And many of these lower income families are often one missed rent payment away from eviction. In Los Angeles, the rate of homelessness for seniors increased 20% from last year to this one. The Department of Education numbers show the number of homeless children in the state has jumped 20% since 2014, and now 23% of the nation's homeless children live in California. The National Center on Family Homelessness reported that 75% of homeless elementary school students perform grades level rose to 85% for high school students. The housing crisis is deeply impacting our young, old, and low-income communities. And people's lives are being upended, while some, mostly Wall Street and corporate landlords, are reaping record profits. The crisis of skyrocketing rents, leading to poverty, displacement, and homelessness, is the urgent crisis proponents like me of Prop 10 seek to fix, and it is one critical piece of solving the broader complex housing crisis the state faces today. So, what is Prop 10? Proposition 10 is a ballot measure that will empower local communities to limit skyrocketing rent increases and address the state's housing affordability crisis. It does that by taking a very limited approach. It simply removes the constraints imposed on local governments by a failed, outdated, state-backed law backed by landlords and passed in the Pete Wilson era called the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act. Essentially, Costa-Hawkins places restrictions on which units can be covered if a municipality chooses to pass rent stabilization measures to protect its tenants from unreasonable rent increases. Removing this restriction and restoring the right of local communities to determine what kinds of protections can apply to all of its tenants allows local governments to take urgent action to address the housing crisis on their terms, should such action be needed. The measure does not mandate rent control or force any community to adopt any new measures they do not want or do not need. As the LA Times simply put it, if passed, the measure would allow local communities to debate and decide what renter protections to adopt, if any. That's important. Although the housing crisis is widespread, each city has its own challenges and needs the flexibility to adopt its own remedies. It is up to the local community to decide what to do. But if a city chooses to establish rent control measures, we know the entire community benefits. Tenants have a greater sense of housing should not be hit with unreasonable increases. Further, having protection means that tenants are not afraid to ask repairs and are able to meaningfully fight for their rights to clean and safe apartments. Prop 10 allows communities to close loopholes in rent control laws that allow predatory landlords to take advantage of people for more profit. But it isn't just tenants that benefit. Landlords are guaranteed a fair rate of return under the California Constitution, which means that they are always able to raise rent enough to make a profit each year, tied to the Consumer Price Index. In fact, data shows that rent-controlled landlords in Los Angeles do nearly as well as market-rate landlords in Los Angeles and better than market-rate landlords in the rest of the country. And since there are more empty units than there are homeless people in many of our larger cities like San Francisco, reasonable limits on rent hikes should put more of these units in the reach of prospective tenants, allowing property owners to fill these vacancies more easily. Non-landlord homeowners like me are not impacted by rent control. However, one big benefit is that our property values and the nature of our neighborhoods and communities would be safeguarded by steps that address the housing crisis. If rents continue to rise and more people are driven into homelessness, that makes our neighborhoods less safe, and that can have negative impacts on our property values. Rent control stabilizes community, which is good for homeowners. And businesses benefit as residents are better able to live where they work and are therefore more likely to spend their money in the local economy. Urban economics and housing expert Peter Dreyer notes, the money from lower rents goes back into the local economy because most people spend almost all their money in the local economy. This will boost local businesses, increase local sales taxes, and increase jobs for businesses that prosper as a result of additional consumer demand. These are a few reasons why Prop 10 is enthusiastically endorsed by nurses, teachers, the California Democratic Party, the League of Women Voters, the ACLU of California, nonprofit developers, the Los Angeles Times, the Sacramento Bee, and hundreds of labor unions, community organizations, tenants organizations, civic rights groups, anti-poverty groups, and even a new but ever-expanding organization of property owners, landlords, and realtors who support fair and affordable housing. Those who oppose Prop 10, Wall Street hedge funds like Blackstone and predatory corporate landlords, the very same wealthy corporate landlords who the opposition warns about in their position summary, they oppose because they have spent the last 20 plus years gaming the system to make more profit at the expense of renters. Consider after the height of the foreclosure crisis, when vacant homes littered communities, Wall Street hedge funds like Blackstone purchased those single-family homes, making them unavailable to community members, and turned them into rentals. Roughly 5 years later, we started to hear horror stories from people living in those units. We released a report with public advocates and Americans for Financial Reform in January of this year, detailing the accounts of tenants of Wall Street landlords. In that report, you can read accounts of tenants who state that their homes were poorly maintained, that maintenance requests were ignored or filled with Band-Aid solutions, and repeated requests were often met with eviction notices. Complaints of mold and leaks leading to rot or flooding were common. Tenants of Blackstone Invitation Homes tell of fee gouging and astronomical rent increases of sometimes more than $1,000 at a time. Blackstone, who is the largest contributor to the No on 10 campaign, is financially benefiting greatly off the vulnerability of the communities they bought property in, while community members' lives are upended. I'll share just one Blackstone tenant story in particular. A member of ACE, her name is Vanessa Bullness. She's a 30-year Oakland resident. She lost her home in the foreclosure crisis after her husband had a stroke, leaving him unable to work. After losing her home, Vanessa and her husband moved into a Colony Capital, which is now Invitation Homes, owned by Blackstone, single-family unit, and went about opening her childcare business that she had run for 2 decades. As is customary, a child care facility evaluator came to the home to evaluate if it was safe for children, but what the evaluator found was very high levels of lead in the soil where the playground was set up. While Vanessa was able to get a protective surface installed as a temporary solution, Colony Capital refused to do any type of repairs. As a result, she was denied a child care contract because of the contaminated soil, and her 22 years as an in-home family child care provider came to an abrupt end. Colony refused to make repairs, directly impacting her employment. And when Vanessa asked if they would be flexible with her rent, they refused and instead aggressively moved to evict her over a problem they created. Vanessa's is a unique story, but there are thousands of unique stories that highlight the lack of care or for community or tenants shown by corporate and Wall Street landlords like those opposing Prop 10. The status quo benefits corporate landlords, not the millions of California renters whose rent is far too high and are in desperate need of protections. Blackstone and corporate landlords against Prop 10 claim that passing Prop 10 will restrict development. And to that I say, cities with rent control are matching and in some cases outpacing their non-rent controlled neighboring cities in the area of development. Dr. Paul Ong, a professor at the director of the Center for Neighborhood Knowledge at UCLA, says that when they looked at the number of new units built in Los Angeles County, there was only a marginal difference in construction between the jurisdictions with rent control and those without it. In other words, the argument that rent control will dampen supply has not been seen historically. On the contrary, a recent study released by the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society argues that strong rental protections can spur development. Here's how. Currently, when wealthier folks are coming into communities, they are moving into older housing and displacing low-income residents who are being pushed out due to unreasonable and unfair rent increases. If those existing tenants were not being forced out, and the new residents would create a demand for market and luxury rate development, leaving more affordable units available to lower income folks. I also want to reiterate that passing Prop 10 doesn't institute rent control. It only opens the possibility for stronger renter protections than are allowed now for cities that choose to take up that option. The Apartment Association and Blackstone argue that cities will pass strict rent control, which will trigger the negative impacts they warn about. But in reality, many, if not most, cities will likely not pass any form of rent control. And those that do will engage in a meaningful and localized debate that folks in the local government and community are best positioned to have. And while the opposition is quick to say that Prop 10 is the wrong solution, they do not have a solution to the displacement and homelessness crisis being experienced across the state. The solution being put forward by the landlord lobby and developers is just to build our way out. And while we agree that we must build supportive housing and affordable housing to our working families and low-income communities, what we know is that right now families are being priced out of their communities at an alarming rate. We cannot wait the 30 years it will take to build our way out. Limiting rent hikes is the only viable solution we have to keep families in their homes and communities. And those communities, which are stronger together, can collectively work to address the housing shortage. I also want to point out that the versions of rent control that the opposition has shown some openness to include rent caps at the consumer price index, usually 2 to 3%, plus 5%. Wages don't grow at that rate. Neither do other costs. So why rent? How could we assume that that would be affordable and reasonable? I'll just close by saying again that Prop 10 is a key part of a multi-pronged solution that the voters will consider in November. Addressing California's housing crisis is our state's, and there is not one simple solution or a silver bullet. That's why there are 3 important housing measures on this year's ballot. Prop 1 to build more affordable housing. Prop 2 to limit Prop 10. It took us decades to get into this mess, and it will take decades to fully get out of it. But we can take a big step forward in November by passing Proposition 10 and clearing the way to slow mass displacement and homelessness now and to the beautiful future where all Californians can enjoy a safe and affordable place to call home. Thank you.
Thank you. No applause, please. Hold your applause. Thank you very much. And now I would like to introduce Dale Hunter. He will be speaking for the con side. He is from the Committee to Protect Political Rights of Minorities.
I feel like I'm at the Supreme Court. Jesus. Thank you all very much. My name is Dale Hunter. I'm here to provide the no side for Proposition 10. I'm here filling in for Miss Alice Huffman, who's the president of the Committee to Protect the Political Rights of Minorities. Ms. Huffman had surgery on Monday, and she's not feeling very well. She's approaching her 83rd birthday. So we told her to chill out, and I'll take it from here. Before I get started, because I am the opposed side, let me start with something I do agree with for the proponents of Prop 10. There are 2 ballot measures that actually do something about housing. Proposition 1, $4 billion bond, where you can actually have cities access that money. That actually gets housing built. Proposition 2, bond, with a particular focus on homelessness, but mental health services is part of that package. So they are 2 measures on the November 6th ballot that address this issue called housing. And I'm here to say we support those. And I'm in agreement with the previous speaker that those are 2 avenues to get us to where we need to go in our great state. Let me tell you a little bit about the Committee for Minorities and Protecting Our Interests. The Committee to Protect the Political Rights of Minorities was started about 25 years ago. It was started by Ms. Huffman, Alice Huffman, and a name you may know, the former mayor of San Francisco, Willie Brown, and the former Speaker of the California State Legislature, Mr. Willie Brown. Mr. Brown was presiding when this measure came before the legislature. I heard the name Pete Wilson, but you also need to know the name Willie Brown was engaged in that debate as well. The committee was formed out of a very simple call from the African American community. We're getting bombarded with these ballot measures. We have no idea what they say, what they do. Does yes mean no? Does no mean yes? And over the years, the African American state legislators and the African American congressional members were just being bombarded with questions from constituents, voters, who are asking for help and understanding what these propositions are all about. Today, the ballot process has been hijacked by billionaires. Billionaires who've mastered the bait and switch process. We've seen it in the African American community in Los Angeles and Oakland and San Francisco, and we're here to say we want to put a stop to it. The bait and switch process is, in our community, we call it sweet poison. Looks good, smells good, tastes good, and 30 seconds later you die. Proposition 10 is a classic bait and switch proposition. They're trying to sell our community sweet poison. In our golden state, the jewel of this nation, our state policy is being driven by people who can pay the most for signature gatherers at Safeway, Walmart, and Costco. That's how this got on the map. You pay the most for signature gatherers, and you can get just about anything on the ballot in our great state. As you know, there are 11 ballot measures on for November 6th. 3 of them were placed there by the legislature and our governor. The others were placed there by special interests, like the proponents of Proposition 10. Their specific reason is they want to bypass the normal state governing process. It's my understanding that the assembly member from Santa Monica, which has had rent control since 1979, I believe, authored a bill this year to repeal the Hawkins Act, the act that the proponents have described as a dangerous and treacherous and old act. Well, as a result, the measure failed. It failed miserably. There was public scrutiny, there was public review. In fact, I doubt if Mr. Bloom's measure ever got out of committee. If this is such a great idea to impose rent control on the rest of us Californians, then why could a simple bill that the proponents say is a simple bill even get out of its first committee? Prop 10 as your basic bait switch measure promised to fix homelessness. They promised to fix housing. And oh, by the way, the bully tactics cannot hide a flawed proposition, especially if you put it under. And I'll share with you an example from last night. I was at my barber's. And in the Black community, the barbershop can be a great place for dialogue. Prop 10 commercial came on, and yes on Prop 10. And 3 of the barbers said, that's that sweet poison stuff. Have you read it? Actually do. As a former staff assistant to the president of the Los Angeles City Council, I'm very familiar with rental issues. In my portfolio as the staff member, I had to engage and in some cases find mediators for rental issues, mostly around evictions. Prop 10, however, will create another layer of bureaucracy, more uncertainty through these rent boards. And don't be fooled. Rent boards are powerful. And I'll give you a classic example of what's happening right now. So the fact that these little rents may or may not be created is a fallacy that I'm going to highlight over and over again. The rent boards will have the authority, the authorization to collect fees and fines on homeowners. Let me repeat that. Today, the rent control measure exempts homeowners and seniors. I had the opportunity to talk to some of the legislators that were here in 1995 and some of the staff who served as the policy consultants for that committee. And they said there were 2 things we were trying to do in the whole rent control debate in 1995. We were trying to protect seniors, and most importantly, we were also trying to protect homeowners. In Prop 10, homeowners are included as part of rent control. And in the African American community, your home is your primary asset. It's the one gift that you can give to your kids or your grandkids. And to have a proposition that potentially could threaten that is a bit scary and frightening. Voters in that city voted it up or down. Those 17 cities, 15 of them have had rent control for a long time. The 2 new ones are Richmond in 2016 and Mountain View in 2016. I talked about rent boards. The biggest fight in Richmond right now is the power of these rent boards. Their measure has only been live for 2 years, and they're already fighting about what role and authorities these rent boards could have in their city. I'm here today representing Ms. Huffman and the committee to protect the political rights of minorities because we reject this so-called Affordable Housing Act. Bait and switch. Affordable Housing Act, when you read it, talks about homelessness and housing. And then finally it gets to the changes to rent control. Today, rent control in your city, all you have to do is get it qualified, put it on the ballot, and let the citizens of that community vote it up or down. In the last couple of months, and the proponents attempt to rush through these rent control measures in case Prop 10 doesn't pass, they've been going around cities and trying to get these on the ballot, local ballot. They failed miserably. Cities like San Mateo, cities like Santa Ana in Southern California, cities like Santa Rosa, they've all said, no, we will take care of this ourselves. We don't need an artificial price control to deal with the issues in our city. So if you wanted rent control today, you can get it. Magic bullet about. There's 15 cities that's had rent control for a number of years. Rent control is not a new subject, folks. There's a lot of data. There's a lot of information. Most propositions are prospective, where you don't have a lot of information, so you're going on the good faith of your friends or folks that you rely on for your legal information. There's a lot of data out rent control and how it played out in those cities. There are some scary concerns. Let me go to my 5 archimos to the measure. Sweet poison. 10 lad resident property control law. The proponent said it might, it could, maybe it's in there. And you don't create a proposition if you're not going to use the powers that's been vested in it. Today, under current Casa Hawkins law, residential homes are exempt. As I said before, the framers in 1995 said 2 people, 2 groups we're solidly supporting that should be protected. Seniors and homeowners. Under this measure that'll be before us on November 6th, homeowners are now in the mix. That's a huge problem for many of us in the African American community. Any rent control that opens the door to single family homes being part of the process is a non-starter. The prospect of a homeowner losing their home because some rent board sets some new fee or some rent board wants a new fine is a frightening thought for homeowners. I talked to legislators. Now that the homeowners are in this new ballot measure, you'll see real shortly a number of African American elected officials that are going to come out strong in opposition to this measure. According to a recent MIT report, the policies authorized by Prop 10 have been shown to reduce property values by more than 10% and significantly restricts what single-family homeowners can do with their home. The average California homeowner could lose $60,000 in value of his or her home if this initiative passes. Because I'm near retirement age, and my home is my retirement nest egg, and anything that artificially threatens that has got me worked up. The average California homeowner, if this measure passes and that city decides to go rent control, and there are some very draconian rent controls, there are some that are basically arbitrators for eviction, The point is, property value is at risk. And in today's market, as I look around the room, nobody want to risk anything as it relates to their wallet. Prop 10 creates these rent boards. I talked about in Richmond, only been in play for 2 years, and they're already fighting like cats and dogs on the role of what is this rent board supposed to do? In Santa Monica, rent control has been around for a long time. The rent board got bigger than the city council. The elected folks that were elected to represent the residents of Santa Monica, the rent board decided that they were going to interpret what the law said locally about their authority. And they claimed their authority was related to any housing issue in the city of Santa Monica. Now, if you're a city council, and some of you may be council members or served on council, you have a general housing plan that lays out what you propose to do and how you're going to deal with your housing element. To have a rent board say, no, that's not what we're going to use, we're going to use something else, is also quite frightening. The rent boards, if you add the number of cities in our great state, this measure becomes a law. It will allow as many as 500 plus rent boards. These are unelected officials, and their role and responsibility is real fuzzy as to what they will be responsible for and how they will operate. The one thing we do know is that their budget, how they survive, will be based on fees and fines to homeowners. Let me repeat that. The budget for the rent boards, now based on the fees and the fines that they're going to get from homeowners. That's part of the fight in Richmond right now, is how far can they reach in terms of generating money. And if you create an entity that doesn't have any money, you know they're going to go out looking for things to do. And now that homeowners is in the mix, they're going to start looking in this direction for homeowners. Many of the cities that currently have rent control, most of them don't have rent boards. Let me repeat that. Most of the cities that have rent control, they don't have rent boards. In our great city here in our state capital, we're debating rent control right now. Some want a part-time, some want, let's try it out. The biggest issue for the city council is, what do you do with rent boards? Some on the council are violently opposed to creating anything that would create a shadow government. Some on the council say, let's just give it a try. But those that have rent boards, some say they've been successful, others say they wish they had went another direction. Again, this is an entity that will be responsible for the housing in your city. At least that's what they're going to claim. The third item for us, the proponents promise immediate relief. The proponents promise immediate relief. We've heard in some of our community meetings that the proponents are saying you could have rate relief as soon as this measure is passed. You could have rate relief, and it could go back to 1995, which was the year that the Hawkins Act was passed. I don't know about you, but in 1995, I was paying $900 for a nice little two-bedroom studio in Los Angeles. That place is not going to go for no $900 today. So the fact that the words rent could go back to 1995 highlights the point that our community is upset about. The fourth reason to oppose this measure is because the proponents have talked about gentrification as the rationale as to why this is a good idea. They've misused gentrification, particularly in our community, which in some sectors of the African American community, gentrification is a bad word. From 2000 to 2016, while the African American population in the state of California remained the same. In the 15 rent-controlled cities, our population decreased by 19%. And in the great city of San Francisco, the African-American population decreased by 24%. Let me repeat that. In the 15 gentrification cities, rent-controlled cities, gentrification has been spurred on by the rent control to the point where the African-American population in some of our great cities is rapidly decreasing, and the Bay Area is leading away. I think I last heard the African-American population in San Francisco is down 2%.
Thank you very much. It's been a long day. Day 1 of 4. And we will be finishing up today. First off, great job. Thanks for staying with us the whole time. Staying through the presentations, the practicing of new skills or revisited skills in the training.